Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Chatterjee, Dr. Vatsayan, Dr. Karan Singh, all our esteemed guests and invitees, ladies and gentlemen. We have assembled here this evening for the 37th Dr. C.D. Deshmukh Memorial Lecture. We commenced these series in 1984, 2 years after he passed away. This lecture is held, besides many other reasons, to remember our founder president. He headed this institution, he founded it, and steered it for 22 years. Till 1982, from 1960 to 1982. He was a person of many parts, versatile, brilliant in his scholarship, academic attainments, linguist, botanist, horticulturist, educationist, and besides, a known economist who was architect of our founding economic and monetary policies. He represented the country in the Bretton Woods Conference, and subsequently when these international institutions came into existence, he was the Indian representative, the Indian governor on the executive committees of the International Bank of Reconstruction, which is subsequently World Bank, and IMF. Then back home, he was in the Planning Commission, he was Governor of the Reserve Bank, he was Finance Minister. And in our library, we have a vast array of literature, writings, not all well put together or catalogued. One of these I came across when I was serving this institution as a director, was a photocopy of a note sent by the then Education Minister, Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad, to Dr. Deshmukh, saying that, recalling a conversation he had with him a few days back of taking over as the founding chairperson of the UGC. And soon after that discussion, Dr. Deshmukh got a personal letter inviting him to be the founding managing director of IMF. But he had already made a commitment to Maulana Sahib, and he wrote back a polite reply that I am not available. When Maulana Sahib got to know about it, he immediately rang him up and said, please come over. I free you from any commitment you made to me. Please go, this is good for the country. But Dr. Deshmukh didn't do that. He stayed on, he did many, many good things, among which this institution stands out as a great organization which has made valuable contribution over the years, and we hope that we will continue to do that. Now today's memorial lecture, we have a very distinguished guest, Professor Ashoke Chatterjee. We had approached him to find out whether he would be willing and available and what would he wish to speak about. And he wrote to me very promptly, suggesting 2-3 variants, but revolving around crafts, artisanship, artisan skills, and the great resource that India has in the arena of handicrafts. So for good reason, the title of this evening's talk is Handcrafting a sustainable future, challenge and opportunity in a new millennium? Now, you would have to hear his views from his own mouth. I can't prejudge, but all I can say is that in his letter to me, brief letter of a page, Professor Chatterjee had pointed to the enormous resource that we possess in India, internationally, viewed worldwide, in the enormous, unending spectrum of skills in the field of handicrafts, artisanship. And while this is not backed up by data, quotable data, but it's not only widely believed, but it is true that our artisans, those involved in one or the other craft, is perhaps the second largest source of livelihood following agriculture and allied areas. So he would be speaking to us on that. But I would say that another reason why he selected this topic was because of his personal friendship with Dr. Vatsan and his knowledge that she, and before her, Dr. Chattopadhyay, had made enormous contribution to raising the importance of crafts and trying to protect those involved in handicrafts and give them the kind of support which would enable them to survive and sustain. I can't say this evening that we have succeeded in this venture. A great deal of work was done. So after Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and Dr. Vatsan and many other stalwarts, ladies and gentlemen, many of them are members, have contributed a great deal to making the IIC known within the country and beyond as a domain for the advocacy of craftsmanship and protection of craftsmen and handicrafted. A word about Professor Chatterjee. He is well known, but he was a background of industrial engineering industry. He's been international civil servant. He served in the ITDC, and for a quarter of a century, he served in various capacities in the National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad, where, besides being a professor of communication and management, he was also the executive director. His interests have taken him in the arena of water supply, sanitation, disabilities, livelihoods, education, and particularly the difficulties, issues relating to artisans in various parts of our country. For 2 decades, for 20 years, he has been honorary president of the Craft Council of India. And thereafter, he has been honorary, still continues honorary advisor of the Craft Council. Amongst his various connectivities, he is associated with the Prabhat Education Foundation for Children with Special Needs, Center for Heritage Management, India Foundation for the Arts, Madras Craft Foundation, Center for Environment Education, Gandhi Ashram. He's an author and writer. He's written on the art of Shantarao. He's also written on the deprived communities in rural Gujarat and what needs to be done to empower them. Presently, very briefly, he is assisting various institutions in design education in India. And I was just talking to him a few minutes ago. He also has interest in providing expertise to Pakistan, some institution in Pakistan who are trying to do some good work in the field of design education. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I gather that Professor Chatterjee is going to speak to us, present us a PowerPoint presentation besides what he's going to tell us. He has a presentation. For that purpose, Kailash, we move down. You want to say anything? Is that it now? And now Professor Chatterjee will speak. So it's all yours, Professor Chatterjee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vohra, and thanks to the IIC for this opportunity to be with many friends. IIC is a very special place for all of us who are connected with the crafts. Kamla Devi was an inspiration she was in fact the founder of the Crafts Council of India, an inspiration to many of my colleagues from the sector who are here. And as far as Dr. Deshmukh is concerned, I think there's this very special link and a very special debt that we owe to him, we who work in the craft sector, because he was the president of the Indian Statistical Institute, and you'll learn in the course of what I'll be sharing that the ISI and statisticians have become our essential partners in addressing the crisis that is facing artisans in our country today. And he was also, I think, he was a member of the first Planning Commission. The Planning Commission also has a central role in the recent history of this sector. And perhaps most important was that he was closely involved with the drafting of the first five-year plan. And that has an importance for us, because the first five-year plan was the first time that crafts was taken into the center of a planned economy anywhere in the world. And its importance was recognized. So we are very grateful for this opportunity, and I say that on behalf not only of myself, but all of my colleagues in the sector, to have this chance to explain the crisis that attends the sector today. It's a crisis which is very hard to explain in the context of the history of 7,000 years, unbroken history of Indian craft. Not only that, but the central role of crafts during the freedom struggle, and the fact that freedom struggles, the centrality of that craft to the freedom struggle was transferred into the approach of modernity, which those who made India free then ensured that it would be as part of the transition from a traditional and colonial and agricultural society into modernity. But there's another part of this, which is that the resource that India represents in terms of artisanal knowledge and skills is the largest in the world. And elsewhere in the world, this is considered to be a resource beyond value, essential to all that we now say about sustainable development. But here in our own country, which has this glorious heritage of crafts, that understanding is still to take place. And this lecture will focus on one part of the struggle for awareness and understanding, which is the economics of the sector. As you just heard, it is often acknowledged as the second largest source of Indian livelihood. And yet we don't have the data to back that claim, which is an extraordinary situation, that a country which says that this is the second largest source of its livelihood doesn't know how many artisans we have, we don't know what they contribute to the GDP. And because of that, investment in this sector, understanding of this sector, the needs of this sector are very, very low as a national priority. But we will be focusing primarily on this aspect of how many are there, because unless we know that answer, we cannot get the priority that this sector deserves. And yet, this is not just about statistics, it's not just about measuring numbers, it's about much more than that. It's about what Gandhiji described the craft sector as the sector which gives meaning to life, and what Gurudev Tagore described as crafts representing life in its completeness. And what the Sustainable Development Goals in the year 2020 tell us, that this sector represents opportunities for sustainability that are not matched by any other industry anywhere in the world. And yet today we are fighting on behalf of the artisans. But just to give you a brief glimpse of artisans, where they come from, what they are facing, what they are doing, let's go to Mubarakpur for a couple minutes through courtesy of AECA, which has made this film, which I recommend you see on YouTube. It's called Weavers of Mubarakpur. Just giving you a little clip so you can hear their voices and understand who are these people who represent the world's largest resource of artisanal knowledge and skills.
हमारा तो हमारे बाप भी करते थे, हमारे दादा भी इसी में जुड़े थे। मेरे पिताजी जो
If there's a problem, we can.
हमारा तो हमारे बाप भी करते थे, हमारे दादा भी इसी में जुड़े थे। मेरे पिताजी जो है एक दो कारखाने हैंडलूम के लगवाए थे। हमारे जो बड़े पापा थे वो खुद उनके वहाँ कार्य लगे थे, काम कराते थे।
सर एक ही हैंडलूम पर 2-3 लोग होते हैं, 4-5 लोग होते हैं। मैं होता हूँ, मेरी वाइफ होती है।
बस सारे परिवार इसी में जुड़े रहते हैं।
कि ये मार्केट जो है कि रेशम नगरी से जानी जाती थी, बाज़ार हमारा। अरे उसमें जो है कि 90% जो है कि दुकानें जो है कि इसी से जुड़ी रहती थी।
टोटल बुनकर का ही घर है, बनाने वाले हैं, बनवाने वाले हैं और सेठ है, मजदूर है। हैंडलूम जो है ये हमारा मुबारकपुर में कड़वा काम होता है, ज़्यादातर मुबारकपुर में। बनारस में बहुत मुख्तसर मिलेगा। मैं जब से हो सवाला तब से तो मैं ये जुड़ा हूँ और तभी से यहाँ जो है ऐसी स्थिति बनी है कि बस आदमी कमा रहा है, जी रहा, खा रहा है। हमको उतनी उन्नति तरक्की नहीं मिल पा रही है। पहले से बहुत फ़र्क हो गया। पहले तो यहाँ सट्टी लगती थी, सट्टी बोलते थे। जगह जगह बड़े बड़े बाहर के व्यापारी आके बैठे थे तो ले आते थे, दिखाते थे और देखते थे, इसको जो अच्छा लगा ले लेते थे। शाम को 2 घंटे के बाद पैसा दे देते। अब ये सब सिस्टम ख़त्म हो गया। जो मेन व्यापारी था हमारा, वो मुबारकपुर में आना ही बंद कर दिया। इसकी वजह से बुनकर बहुत ज़्यादा डाउन हो गया। अब आते नहीं है। बनारस में आ गए, यहाँ के सेठ को फ़ोन कर दिया, वो मास्टर को फ़ोन करके बोल दिया कि ये साड़ी इतनी हमको चाहिए, ये भेज दिए। ऐसे हम जाते थे तो हमको 2 पैसा बढ़ती मिलता था। अभी हम मास्टर को दे रहे हैं तो नफ़ा मास्टर को खा जाता है, सिर्फ हमारी मजदूरी तक रह जाता है। अब बुनकरों की जो मजदूरी आज के 15-20 साल पहले 200 रुपये थी, 225 250 रुपये थी, आज हमको मजदूरी सिर्फ 400 रुपया मिल रही है एक दुपट्टे की।
वो अपनी मजदूरी बढ़ा नहीं सकता, इसलिए कि वो सिर्फ जो है कि बुनकर जो है कि बुनाई ही करता है, उसी से जुड़ा हुआ है। वो 2 दिन, हफ्ता 10 दिन नहीं अगर भी करेगा तो उसकी जो है कि उसके रोज़मर्रा या खाने पीने का ज़रिया जो है ख़त्म हो जाएगा।
टोटल मुबारकपुर में हैंडलूम था। धीरे धीरे मार्केट ख़राब होने की वजह से लोग हैंडलूम से हटते गए, पावरलूम पर आते गए।
We started working with the Vohra Muslim community of Mubarakpur in 2014.
Now the Mubarakpur cluster, as far as I understand now, is one of those clusters which had been doing very well initially, then it gradually declined.
Because they had lost the market, the skills had declined, and also they were consumed by the branding of Banaras and they didn't have an identity of their own.
That way, I mean, I'm credit ICA with having stayed on and with having faith and having built up their relationship very strongly and continuing to do.
उन्होंने हमसे ये कहा कि हम आपको काम करना चाहते हैं, मतलब हमारे साथ जुड़ोगे? हमने कहा ठीक है जुड़ेंगे। ये ताना बाना जो है सब दिया, हम लोग बिने और हमको जो है सैलरी मिलती गई। उन्होंने हमसे कहा कि मतलब ये धंधा आप लोगों का है।
आते हैं हर महीने 2 महीने पर, समझाते हैं, बताते हैं, जो हमारी कमी रहती है वो बताते हैं कि आप ऐसे नहीं हो पा रहा है, ऐसे करो ऐसे करो। एक नियम बनाया कि तुम बुनाई भी करते हो, तुम खुद जाके मार्केट में तुम बेचोगे तो तुम्हें मालूम पड़ेगा क्या चाहिए, क्या चीज़ की ज़रूरत है। कहें कि नहीं हमको ये कलर चाहिए, तभी इसमें से दो आदमी बार बार निकलते हैं। कभी कोलकाता, कभी हैदराबाद, कभी मुंबई।
अब क्या है, हम लोग ज़्यादा पढ़े लिखे तो हैं नहीं। अब वो हमको आके समझाती है कि लिखना पढ़ना, माल कैसे लिया जाता है, कैसे दिया जाता है, कैसे जो है हिसाब रखा जाता है, बहुत सी चीज़ें हमको समझाई और हमको कैसी फिनिशिंग देनी है जिससे हम सफाई और अच्छाई और हमको मिलती गई।
That's a quick trip, crash course perhaps in the struggle that artisans all over the country face today. And we'll come back to these issues, but although we're not going to be talking very much about the market, you will understand how central that preoccupation is. Because nothing that we've shared this evening will make any sense unless in the marketplace there's a demand for handmade quality and a willingness to pay for it. And that is the essence of it. You saw that horrifying figure of earning 250 to 300 rupees a day, which only very recently, the latest handloom census, has reinforced. That's the state of this great profession of craft. The weavers are amongst those who are our greatest artisans, and that's what they are facing today. And the only thing that can transform that is to empower these communities, of which you've just seen a glimpse, give them access to markets, and build up a demand for handmade quality in this country and, of course, overseas. But we'll be exploring part of that. I hope I can manage this without making a mess. I'd like to start by drawing your attention, since these days what counts is getting the approval and the sanction of the corporate sector. How do I move here? Yes, okay. Yes, right. Yes. Okay, just take a quick look at this. This is from Mr. Venkatesan, who was the former chairperson of Microsoft. And we're going to be talking quite a bit about statistics. There is a statistic up there of 250 million, is what he calculates to be the number of artisans that he has been able to identify. The official figure of the government of India is 11 million. So you'll understand that if you're talking about 11 million or you're talking about 250 million, you're not in the same ball game. How do you plan for an industry or for a future for artisans like the ones you saw if you don't know whether they represent a community of 11 million or 250 million, although 11 million is not a small number? I hope I know how to do this. Okay. The issue here is that while we are going to focus on statistics, just keep in mind that what we represent as a craft culture, because we certainly don't want to give the impression that the Crafts Council of India and its partners who've been part of the struggle that I'll be sharing with you today are obsessed only with economics. But unless we get the economics understood, everything else seems to fall through the cracks. Because this industry needs investment. And that earning has to dramatically change. Because unless that changes, everything else we do will be of very little consequence. So while the focus is on statistics and on this dismal reality that in 2020, India, supposedly the largest resource of artisanal knowledge and wisdom in the world, does not know the dimensions of this sector, how can we go about changing that? That's the challenge that my colleagues and I have been trying to address over the past years. Now, I've already mentioned that we don't have the data to back this claim. And I've also mentioned that it's not just about economics. It's about that concept that the craft culture brings us close to who we once were and hopefully who we want to be in a more just and sustainable world. This crisis has been with us for quite a long time. Exactly 100 years ago, Gandhiji drew attention to this crisis. In 1919, he made a statement writing in Young India, and this is what he had to say. And don't miss the very last lines. We may be guilty of strangling them with our own hands, which seems to be what we are now doing. And he wrote this 100 years ago. And the same problem, part of it is our fault, we who work in this sector. We came into it because of our love of crafts. We did not involve economists, and we should have. Neither, alas, did many of the stalwarts who did so much for crafts before independence and after independence. Somehow the economics, it was assumed, would take care of itself, but it didn't. And it hasn't. Now, under Gandhi's leadership, you will recall how crafts moved into the center of the freedom movement. The charkha and the handloom revolution was the most important design story of the last century. And both at the time of the freedom struggle and afterwards, there was no dichotomy between the importance of crafts and India's image of itself as a modern, industrial, scientific, and technological country. That, alas, was going to change. And that change of attitude is what has given us many of the problems that we have faced. This came back even earlier. In the discovery of India, Jawaharlal Nehru wrote about crafts and how it represented a resource that India would draw upon as it moved into freedom. But what brought crafts into the center of consciousness after freedom was not this glorious past. It was the disaster of partition. When thousands of uprooted human beings came across the border, and in this famous photograph by Margaret Bourke-White, moved into relief camps, and this one is at Purana Killa, the horror of resettling millions of people brought craft into the center of consciousness. It was then that Jawaharlal Nehru turned to Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and said, do something. And what did she do? She took needle, thread, and textile and went into the relief camps and asked the traumatized women who were there to make something, to keep sane, to have some element of hope and dignity, to remind themselves of the beauty and what they had loved, which they had left behind. Not only that, whatever was made in those camps had to be sold. And so the Indian Cooperative Union took a little space of an old US Army barrack on Janpath and started what later became the Central Cottage Industries Emporium. This is important to understand because when the 5-year plan is formulated a couple years ago, you can understand this is the background. And that is why you have the first 5-year plan saying that the importance of this sector can hardly be exaggerated. From freedom movement, or perhaps even earlier, from heritage, the freedom movement, to partition, to providing employment, to managing a disaster of a scale that the world had never seen before, providing hope, and also, at that time, finding opportunities for Indian handicrafts to find a market not only in India but overseas. Because at this time of India's history, please remember, the need for foreign exchange was pressing. And crafts were identified as products which India could find markets from overseas, which in turn could provide the foreign exchange which was needed to build a modern economy. What is important is that the founding documents of that era see no contradiction between age-old crafts and modernity. But decades later, my colleagues and I would be told that crafts represented a sunset industry, that what we represented was an embarrassment, a bit like snake charmers and maharajas. Let it go. Let the sun set. This industry has nothing to do with India's aspirations for global power. And that attitude probably has much to do with the crisis that those weavers are facing, because it is not seen as contemporary, and it is contemporary. So this synergy is what was so wonderful in those days, and which today is recognized around the world, everywhere except in the country which should have been the pioneer for this type of synergy between the past, the present, and the future. So how do we describe this sector today? We don't have the data to tell you what it represents. There are guesstimates, and I'll be sharing some of those, but in the 12th five-year plan, it was assumed that this would be the largest non-farm sector in rural India. And this becomes another important thing to remember, that Indian craft has always been associated with our villages. Today, much of India's crafts is made in urban slums because there's no infrastructure in the villages to support activity. And you've seen the conditions in which the weavers of Mubarakpur live. And the tragedy of migration into the urban centers requires non-farm livelihoods in the locations where people live. And that is what the craft sector offers. And that is what is being neglected tragically. So, if we are the largest resource of craftsmanship in the world, we have now to turn to others to learn. Because elsewhere in the world, the concept of creative and cultural industries has emerged as a very powerful economic sector. According to some, it has overtaken the petroleum industry, the telecommunication industry, and according to some, the armaments industry. But who in our country would recognize those weavers of Mubarakpur as stakeholders of what may be the largest industry in the world? And how can we make that shift in attitude, and in understanding. What the sector offers is stability and this range of other contributions, all of which are critically important, particularly at a time when the planet is faced with the threat of climate change, and you have this industry which has the lowest carbon footprint of any industry that you can imagine. And it's your second largest source of livelihood. Even then, we fail to wake up. Sustainable jobs at the bottom of the pyramid. We are talking about jobs and the necessity of jobs all the time. Open any newspaper, it's right there in front of you. Exports, there is a history now. The only reliable data that is available today in this sector is in the export sector. And that is dramatic because it shows that even in periods of recession, there's been no fall in Indian exports. And we find that time and time again. This industry, not just in India but elsewhere in the world, survives cycles of recession. Something profound should be learned from that. When are we going to learn it? And then, of course, the link with crafts and tourism. Dr. Karan Singh is here during the time when he was heading the tourism ministry. Crafts moved in to India's strategy as an international destination. Brought crafts into the center of that whole experiment of making India a destination that people would want to come to. But it's not just that. It's a fact that most of our artisans are those who are still at the margins of our society. 50% of the work is done by women. SC, ST, tribal communities, and minorities. And it's a socio-economic safety net which has no equal. For example, this is the handicraft map of India. On the right is the so-called red corridor. Now try and put the red corridor on top of the other map, and you will see that it represents some of the most craft-rich regions of our country. Do a little photoshopping in your mind and color J&K and the Northeast. Two other parts of our country which are rich in crafts. One in a lockdown, where artisans cannot move their products out at the peak season, and the other seriously disturbed. What does this tell us about our understanding of crafts and of craft? A safety net in disturbed regions. Do we care? Do we even know? I've already mentioned this huge contribution that crafts makes to the global crisis. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and the Sustainable Development Goals today are the benchmarks against which progress is evaluated around the world. India's craft sector addresses 11 of 17 goals directly, including Goal 12, which is responsible production and responsible consumption. Production and consumption that does not endanger future generations. So if we're talking about statistics and we're talking about measuring, the problem arises is that how do we understand this sector? What is a craft and who is an artisan? What do you include and what do you leave out? Are papas a craft, making agarbattis, making bricks, making pickles? What do we do? How do we identify this sector? It's not easy to do, but there have been definitions that have been made, and the need now is to capture a concept of handmade in India according to established definitions. The Government of India has an excellent definition. So too does the World Trade Organization. It's a longer but a very important one, because when we do the counting, we have to get out of the lists of which ministry handles what, and we have to attend to this. And then we will begin to understand the size of what is at stake. And we are nowhere near that exercise. This is how an artisan is described, and pay attention to the emphasis on traditional knowledge systems. This is so critical. We learnt it when I was at NID, when we were working with Professor Yashpal with the Indian Space Research Institute. And there we found that one of the most delicate operations when a space satellite is being made at ISRO, the testing of flame, was done optically by an Urali vessel maker from Kerala. That's the kind of knowledge, scientific and technical knowledge, which they carry in their heads and hands. And this gentleman could do it more accurately than any of the instruments that ISRO had in either Ahmedabad or Bangalore. And they had access to the best instruments in the world. So that one example is to tell you that it's not just about beautiful things in emporia. It's about how this wisdom translates into every sector of manufacture and of competition. There is also another problem we face in this sector, and that is of the language we use. We call crafts unorganized and informal. And this terrible language is used over and over again. And it is absolute BS. Right? Because no Indian craft is unorganized. And no Indian craft is informal. They are differently organized. They have their own formalities. But when you use language like this, you disrespect it. And nowhere else in the countries where crafts are respected is this kind of absurd language used to describe what should be our national treasures. So we have a semantic problem as well. In about the beginning of this century, international organizations began to look at the problem and the challenge of measuring this sector. And the early work was done by UNESCO. And this is one of their reports on measurement. These are some of the organizations that then have been looking at what is this phrase, which is now called creative and cultural industries or cultural and creative industries, and have over and over again pointed to the importance of this sector for development across the world, whether they're talking about the UK or Scandinavia or Japan or Latin America or Asia or India. I put this there because, except for OECD, we are members of all these institutions. And they have been saying this over and over again. There isn't time to go into what they have been saying, but almost every one of these organizations, there is an important quote which emphasizes the critical importance of this sector and appeals to countries which have lost their crafts to go back to them and find them and build them. And we haven't lost them, but we might be doing what Gandhiji said that we seem to be wanting to do. I want to make one reference here to what you see here about the Inter-American Development Bank. In 2013, they came out with this extraordinary report called the Orange Economy, which was a report to awaken Latin America to the resources it had and could compete with. And they chose the word orange, inspired by, they said, the color that India holds sacred. That's something that we might remember. The World Bank did a huge amount of work in 2000 to bring this concept into the public space. And they did it initially to assist countries which were at the brink of globalization. And then something interesting happened. Something interesting happened because in 2005, the UN system, with World Bank support, held a meeting in Jodhpur. And we have some of our colleagues here who were at that meeting. And the Jodhpur Consensus on Cultural and Creative Industries is the seminal document for the growth of this consciousness throughout the world, everywhere it seems, except in the country in which Jodhpur is located. Right? But what the Jodhpur Consensus says, and I'll read it, is that what cultural industries have in common is that they create content, use, creativity, skill, intellectual property, and produce goods and services with social and cultural meaning. Following that, there have been many other multilaterals which have contributed to this awareness, and most important then comes the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda to which India is committed. I've already mentioned how important that is to the understanding of the importance of this sector. 17 goals, 11 goals this industry contributes directly, including goal number 12, which is almost a mandate for the craft sector. Apart from that, you have the examples of other countries, including many in our neighborhood. In 2014, was it, Manju? We were in China at the World Crafts Council seminar. And the gentleman who came down from Beijing said that 10 years before that, that's in 2004, China had identified 2 industries as absolutely critical to its growth as a world power. One of those was IT. The second one was craft. And the word that was used were, these are China's sunrise industries. And we had come out of Delhi having been told at the highest quarters that what we were doing in our sector was a sunset industry. And we rushed to the translator's booth to check whether we'd actually heard it right. Did this gentleman say sunrise? Indeed, he did. So right in our own neighborhood, we have an incredible example of that. And then came this extraordinary slogan from the heart of the European Union. The future is handmade. When we contacted our friends in Europe to say, what on earth do you mean? Do you mean you're going to close down your factories and go back to handmade? They said, the issue is well beyond that. If you want to succeed in this competitive markets of the world, your only real resources are creativity and innovation. And the only culture from creativity and innovation comes from is the craft sector. We in Europe have lost our crafts. We have to bring them back. This is the slogan from the European Union. It should have been ours. Earlier, there had been some very important studies in India to which perhaps attention was not adequately paid. One of them was this study, which was done by an organization called Shri, and I think it was 1995. An extremely important document, which looked at 8 craft sectors and analyzed it. And I'd like to quote what they said. Today, these very artisans have been marginalized by the modernization and industrialization of society. Artisans have no prospects for a better tomorrow. You heard what they said on that clip. The new economic and industrial order that is emerging concedes no space to the artisanal sector. And a few years later, Maureen Leibel, who is here, and her colleague, Professor Tirthankar Roy, now at the London School of Economics, came out with a seminal article in the Economic and Political Weekly called Handmade in India, a preliminary analysis of craft producers and craft production. And they stated, this is in 2003-2004, that artisanal skills do not command the recognition and respect they deserve. They felt that perhaps part of this was the problem that they represent castes who are not acceptable in polite society, low levels of education, high levels of poverty, and the lack of access to communication and information. Around the same time, Rajiv Sethi was attempting to bring the concept of creative and cultural industries into the Planning Commission. And he put together 3 volumes contained in this CD of reference materials to show what India's resources in this sector actually were. He didn't find many takers. So this was the context, the backdrop for the work that the Crafts Council of India began in 2009 to map the scale of India's craft sector. That was the year when we heard this description of our sector as being a sunset, hopeless case that should be allowed to set, perhaps pulled out occasionally for festivals, maybe put into museums, but of no critical importance. And we could not challenge this because there was no reliable data. We were told there was no reliable data. So how do you argue for a sector without the data and without the facts? So how many Indians constitute the world's largest resource? And this is Exhibit A of this lecture. This is the variety of estimates of how many artisans we have. And it's a difficult job. It's not that any one of those who's put these figures together is a fool. It's a question of definition. How will you map this sector? You have to do a lot of patient homework to decide what you're going to capture. And it varies, as you can see. The most important estimate here is the 10 to 11 million, which is the official estimate of the Ministry of Textiles. Please understand that the Ministry of Textiles is where the Development Commissioner Handicrafts and the Development Commissioner Handlooms sit. But these offices have been moving from ministry to ministry right from the time of the first 5-year plan, at which time they were part of the Commerce and Industry Ministry at that time. Today they are in textiles. Okay, but what is the job of the Ministry of Textiles? Its main preoccupation is the mill sector. And wood, metal, stone, cane and bamboo, these crafts can hardly be described as textiles. But the responsibility for them is in the Ministry of Textiles. Apparently that doesn't strike anybody as odd. But just look at this scale and you'll understand why there is this frustration. Right up to 250 million. The 200 million figure is our guesstimate. after work that we did, which I'll explain in a minute. But 250 comes from the chairman of Microsoft. So whose job is it to build this? At one time, we were told that here in New Delhi, there were about 30 ministries and departments whose work impinge on artisans, not just the Ministry of Textiles. And this is the list that we have put together on the current avatars of these sectors. As you will see, it's quite a range. And there's no evidence that these groups have ever sat around the table to map out a strategy for the sector that represents the world's largest resource of artisanal knowledge and skill. And you've just had, a few days ago, the suggestion that there should be a separate ministry for what our colleague Prasanna calls the sacred economy. And he describes the sacred economy as those activities of which 60% is human labor and 60% is local raw material. And what I like about this is that his demand for a ministry of sacred economy resonates with our colleagues in Latin America who came out with the report on the orange economy. In 2009, we got fed up because there was nobody else apparently who was going to take up this task of mapping. So with a small grant from the Tata Trusts, we started a process with the help of economists in two pockets, one in Tamil Nadu and the other in Kutch, to see whether a methodology was possible to assess the scale and contribution of artisans to the Indian economy. It took more than a year to do this, but we did it. And when it was done, we went to Calcutta and called in peers to do a peer review of what we had found. And Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi was then the governor in West Bengal, and he joined the discussion. And this is what he said on the last day. But he also said to us that if you want to get across to the government of India, you'll have to understand that arguments cannot just be about the heart, it'll be about the head. So you'll have to take your findings to the Planning Commission, which is what we did. We took this study to the Planning Commission, and there we got the first spark of encouragement and recognition. And it was there that Dr. Saida Hamid suggested that we move across to the Ministry of Statistics, which was then about to launch the 6th Economic Census. And because of the elections that were going on in several states, there was a 3-month window of opportunity. So we rushed across to Sardar Patel Bhavan, and there we met with statisticians and made our case. And one of the extraordinary things about the experience we've had over these 10 years is that the finest support and understanding we have ever had has been from statisticians, which I would have imagined would be the very last place that you would find anyone interested in the weavers of Mubarakpur. But we did find support from them, and artisans moved into the economic census for the very first time since independence. It was explained to us that the economic census will not tell us what we want. It will give us only some broad indicators, because this census only counts people who are entrepreneurs, leaving out millions of artisans. But even then, we were told by the Ministry of Statistics, you will get some pointers. And after we look at those pointers, then let us try and do a census specific to handmade in India. And this report became a watershed. It became a watershed which is what we now have as our resource for trying to move ahead. And what it did was to identify 2 million craft entrepreneurs. Now, a new empowering language moved into our dictionary. Not just talking about artisans, but craft entrepreneurs, each of them employing, according to the census, rule of thumb, 2 other people. So you have 4 million. We know that in the craft sector, a weaver will have at least 6 to 8 people working for him. So from that, we were able to come to that figure that you saw of approximately 12 to 16 million based on the 6th economic census. And it recommended that now there should be something called the satellite account, which is a separate census specific to handmade in India. But who would do that? To do that meant another methodological survey, working in the field, looking at the puzzles that were coming out of the data of the economic census. For example, the economic census told us that Rajasthan and Gujarat are not amongst the top states for craft production. We know they are. So there were many puzzles like that which would have to be teased out, and we'd need to move into it. So who would do this work? Who would be responsible from that list of ministries to actually do this work? There was no one. So once again, we fanned out across the country to find out what should be done. And with the support and advice of the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta, we got in touch with the Institute of Human Development in Noida, and with them framed research proposals. And took those proposals to Niti Aayog, the only institution which might have that overview which was so essential. We went to Niti Aayog because they have a research grant window. And we submitted proposals in October 2018, and that process is still ongoing. We're also looking at support from the private sector, from others, because a survey of this kind will cost at least 50 to 70 lakhs, which is peanuts. But for an NGO, it's a huge amount of money. And our hope is that if Niti Aayog gives a small research grant, then that gives us credibility to go to other donors and build up the amount of money which is needed to develop a methodology which we bring back to the Ministry of Statistics and say, here is the methodology which you can use for the satellite account for this sector. And so it goes. 2020, that's where we are. The search continues. And what is at stake? Apparently, we need 10 to 15 million jobs every year. And there's a frightening spectrum of jobless growth all around us. We are also told by no less than the finance minister that 90% of the national workforce is in this so-called informal sector. And this is what she said the other day in September. So it's no wonder that we don't have the data, because the finance minister tells us quite frankly that the informal sector is where the majority of employment is, but she doesn't have the data for it. So who's going to find that out? And she says, very kindly, that she's willing to hear from them. But who is them? Because the artisans are not organized. They don't do rail rokos, rasta rokos. They don't move out in dharnas. They can't stop traffic all over the country, despite their numbers. So who's going to speak on their behalf? And let me close with some comments from colleagues who've been working with us on this long journey. And one of our colleagues, Shekhar Mukherjee in Calcutta, says that there is no question about the value of the products. The real problem is the value of the producer is not respected. And another colleague, Uzrama in Hyderabad, who's done phenomenal work, she's more optimistic than I am, She says the tide is going to turn in favor of low energy technologies. And this will be the greatest contribution that the craft sector will make to a resurgent economy in this country. I hope she's right. Or we can go to Professor Krishna Kumar, who, during his years at the NCERT, introduced a fine curriculum in the school syllabus so that children would appreciate the craft cultures and grow up as intelligent consumers of crafts. And this is what he had to say, that the transformation to modernity of 60% of our people may depend on this sector. Now, I'll just go back to something rather interesting, that in a time when we are all obsessed with climate change, a few years ago, in 2015, Prime Minister Narendra Modi gifted this volume to every delegate at the Paris Climate Summit. And this document listed India's culture that addresses the global crisis of climate change. And in this document were examples for 8 key sectors, from energy to water to agriculture, and the bulk of them, as you can see from the cover, were from the handmade industry. And yet, in the most recent, I think it came out just last week, what do they call it? It's a summary of the India's progress to the Special Development Goals. There is no reference to the craft sector, although we address 11 of the 17 goals. And it's not surprising, because where is Niti Aayog going to find the data to feed into its report on India's progress towards the Special Development Goals? The data does not exist. So you can see that one after the other, we seem to come back to the beginning, to the man who saw it all, understood it, and who perhaps had the foresight to understand what was needed, but nobody listened to him, or to Gurudev, for whom it was life in its completeness, and possibly life in its completeness is what this lady and her child understand. So that's the end of this particular journey. One doesn't want to end on a pessimistic note, so let me take you back for a couple minutes to Mubarakpur. Can we have the last bit? Where you will understand what can happen when sensitive interventions take place. Oops.
Yeah, I'll just close this first.
That's the PowerPoint.
Yeah, this one.
One of the biggest crises in handicrafts or handlooms is certainly that they've never felt respected or felt that they have a place in society. Poor weaver, poor weaver. The weaver has shown that he can be financially, and it's good for him. And also it's good, that helps him being educated, his family, he can take care of his family. It gives him a certain self-respect and self-worth.
Hussein and Mustafa, whom we had identified, and from the beginning we have really built their capacities also. Building the capacity of the youth in entrepreneurship, even when they are not actually producing the product, but they are aware of weaving and they know how to weave. Hussein and Mustafa has really taken the lead, and they really have proven to be leaders of this group, where They are the interface with the market, they do the production planning, and they maintain the self-help group.
It's not a question of monetary thing or something, but you feel that people know, at least recognize you for something that you're doing. It's worthwhile what you're doing.
The whole issue of equality between the maker and the buyer. The fact that prices are fixed and we don't haggle. And again, that creates a kind of equality. The fact that a product is branded and you stand behind your name.
भी जाते हैं एग्जीबिशन में, कस्टमर ये मुबारकपुर कहाँ था भैया, तो मुबारकपुर का एक ब्रांड बन गया है, एक जानने में लगे कि मुबारकपुर की जगह जहाँ हैंडलूम का काम होता है। हम बताते हैं पूरा जो अपना ग्रुप के बारे में है, जब से बना है, कब से काम क्या ट्रेडिशन क्या है, वो हम पूरा कस्टमर बताते हैं। फिर बहुत शौक हो जाते हैं, अच्छा है इतने दिनों से काम होता है, काम होता है, तो कोई पहचान नहीं थी।
Thank you.
Prof. Chatterjee is willing to cater to a few questions if any member of the audience would like any clarification or any further observation. Yes, Dr. Karan Singh, please.
Tremendous ingenuity and genius of the Kashmiris over all these centuries with their weaving and their carpet making and their shawl making.
Absolutely. There is a group here in Delhi. Where does one start with Kashmir? Kashmir is the heart of our craft experience in so many ways, because it is a region which is dependent on craft. The Northeast and Jammu and Kashmir represent that. So when we talk about how there's this shouldn't be negotiable. We shouldn't be arguing about crafts when we have a region like Jammu and Kashmir on the one hand, and the entire Northeast where every single man, woman and child is an artisan. But we are like that only. How is it possible for a country with these kind of resources to be in a situation where it doesn't even know how many artisans there are in Jammu and Kashmir? Just now, well, let me just go back 1 minute, Dr. Karan Singh. You're talking about the artisans in Jammu and Kashmir. Look at what they are facing today. This is their peak season, and they can't move their products out. Laila and her others have been working tirelessly with a concern for Kashmir and their artisans. One of them managed to get to Ahmedabad the other day. And it really broke our heart, because he's been through so much trauma that he couldn't cope with one exhibition in a city so far away. All his self-confidence had been taken away from him. And these are people who've roamed around the country for years. But this is what has happened to them with this incredible lockdown. Then look at the Northeast. Look at what we have done to these artisans in our country recently. Demonetization finished them. And it came at a peak season of sales, when they should have been going around the country selling their products, gone. Just as they were about to come out of that, GST hit them. And we had to face the difficulties of artisans moving around the country, not knowing what they were doing, being threatened, having to pay bribes, trying to find chartered accountants in villages. I mean, what on earth is going on? And you take these policy moves, and this sector, Dr. Karan Singh, is invisible. They had time to consult with all the other sectors. But did they give 15 minutes on GST to the craft sector? Did they give just 15 minutes to understand that your second largest source of livelihood, there are no chartered accountants sitting in Indian villages? And even if they were, would there be power to run their computers? They're just trying to come out of that. And that's the incredible resilience of this amazing artisan community have. They're so resilient. And the other day, when I was talking about this in Rajasthan, one of the young entrepreneurs said, "Will you stop wailing? Aap kyun rote rehte ho? Just give us entrepreneurship training, give us language skills, give us e-commerce, give us things to do, stop this wailing and just do something for us." Basically telling me to either shut up or put out. But I think it's the astonishing, I still can't understand where this came from. A country of Gandhi, Tagore, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, Pupul Jayakar, all these greats. And we don't have a clue about how many people we have. And when we go to raise money for this survey, we are constantly fobbed off, Dr. Karan Singh. We're told all the data is there. But the Ministry of Statistics is saying the data ain't there. The problem is, the real problem, is caring. This sector does not mean enough to enough people in positions of power. And it's not just this government, it's the one before also. Plenty of lip service. Look at the one on climate change. You go to Paris with a volume and pay tribute to the people who make by hand climate-friendly products and services. But when you're reporting to the UN on your special development goals, not a word about the craft sector. I think we have a particular kind of madness, which I'm sure your scholarship will explain, but I can't.
Ashoke, you're well aware that one of the biggest threats to the handloom sector comes from the powerloom sector.
Yes.
Now, we have an organization called the Indian Trust for Rural Heritage and Development, and we are working in Mubarakpur, helping them and providing them marketing support. We organized Atambar Festival in Delhi for the last 7-8 years, and in Lucknow, and this year we're going to take them to Calcutta. And the problem that we faced was some of the weavers were tempted to bring in powerloom projects.
Yep.
But this year, we were in December, we had our last festival. We asked IKEA to check each weaver who had brought a stall. And I said, if anyone is found to have powerloom projects, he'll be devoured for the future and he'll be thrown out. We found one person. In fact, he was very proudly proclaiming, can we sell this, and he was, but how do we deal with this problem of...
it's a huge
it's the easiest way out for them to earn more money.
And there are many people here who are better qualified to answer that than I am. I don't see the problem quite in the sense of black and white. Powerloom is here to stay. And Powerloom and mill gives you the people's fabric. Khadi was once that, but it's not that now. What we want is people willing to pay for handmade quality. And what we want is not powerloom stuff to be passed off as handloom, which is what is happening all the time. Now that requires a strong marketing organization, branding, labeling, consumer education. No one is handling that. Well, some of us in civil society are, some brands are handling that, but not on a national scale. So if a weaver decides to, and we know many weavers who are doing both, when they talk about wanting to get out of powerloom, in my limited experience, it's not so much because they understand that they feel that powerloom is evil and they should stop it. It's the horrendous working conditions in the powerloom, which is just, it kills your ears and brain in no time. But we need mill-made fabric. We need mass-produced fabric. Fine. But that doesn't displace craft, and it shouldn't be sold as handmade. We were just talking this morning, is there a possibility of reviving Handloom House, which used to be the go-to place? Because if Handloom House could be revived, and people know that if you go to Handloom House, you're paying for handmade, your label is correct, you're getting what you're paid for, that surely could be a start. And of course, I think the best people to make a deciding whether they want to go to powerloom or not is the weaver. And we have always found, in my limited experience, their decisions are always sound. Their decisions are always sound. And if some do both, I wouldn't worry about it, because they become the champions of the handloom.
You wanted to say?
Thank you, Ashok, for keeping the fighting spirit on. And from Javaja to Mubarakpur, you're still there. Wonderful.
How long? No,
but what I
don't
want
know.
to say is that there really has been a structural adjustment in the aesthetic tastes in this country. And from the point when we grew up, being taught to admire by people like Kamla Devi and Purple Jaikar and others, and so we had a feel for the handloom and the handcraft and couldn't go anywhere else. You now have a whole, not one generation, but a couple of generations that have grown up with the communication that's been fed by the media, by the television, by everything else that's visual around us. And so you have a situation today where the malls are full and people are buying, and you go to the handicraft and handloom bazaars, and you see the most beautiful products there, but no buyers. So I think we need to look at, you as a communication expert, to look at that side also. What can we do to bring back that aesthetic? The other is that while excellent crafts are coming up, I mean, on one side we have a wholesale displacement because there are the cheap Chinese products and others that are coming. But on the other hand, when you do have something exclusive, there is a tendency for what are called the artist entrepreneurs to take over. So you will have khadi saris that I have bought from Gandhigram with, as I said to the entrepreneur, now with only a few more zeros attached. And those zeros are not going to the khadi weavers, but they're going to these entrepreneurs. So, there's several problems that come up. And I think with your fighting spirit, weave them into your discourse. And let's see where we can go. Because you're right, this is the one area that could be the answer to many of the economic problems. And it's shocking that Nirmala Sitharaman has not found time, because this is the GST issue has been coming up again and again. But why are you not able? Why are people like you and Laila and others that have names not been able to reach Nirmala Sitharaman. I think you should come on to
Well,
tell
the
us
first issue
why.
that you raised, Rami, which is the critical one of who cares and who will buy, because the last generation was brought up to appreciate something. I'm not that pessimistic, because in my view, this generation of young people are far more sensitive to stories that really mean something than my generation was. The problem is we're not telling them the stories. And this was not a discussion about marketing, but I did point out right in the beginning that the essence of this whole exercise is marketing, of creating a demand for handmade quality. And not just at one level, at every level, from the gamcha to the Banarasi brocade. And that is something that nobody is addressing. So if we have another session on the marketing challenge, we can go into this. Geeta Ram is now sitting right behind you. Fortunately, I think from the experience of Laila, Geeta, Jaya Jetli and others, they would say that when you have a craft bazaar with quality, people come and people buy. And this is the best sign, because I think from what I've been told by my colleagues repeatedly, is that those who are buying are young people. And this is very, very important, because the story of crafts now has to be in terms of looking after each other and looking after the planet. And they are sensitive to that. The old stories are fine for history, but the handloom is not the answer to people's cloth anymore. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. There's another great story, and we should be telling it. And I feel a little bit worried, partly because I am a bit of a bevkoof. I don't sometimes know the difference between handloom and powerloom. And sometimes my colleagues will tell me, oh my God, that kurta is not handloom. What are you doing in it? I bought it and I like it. But the issue is, are we educating the next generation? Because they are the buyers of tomorrow. And that's why I particularly wanted to bring in Professor Krishna Kumar, because this NCRT curriculum, to my mind, is the key to the future. I think there was somebody.
Sudasa? Then
good evening. As you very rightly mentioned, that it's not just about economics, but it does play a role, a huge role. So is your group or groups you are working with working on the concept of glamour attached in being a weaver, becoming one, becoming a weaver? You know, there is already a lot of glamour in wanting to show off the most beautiful pashmina shawl. You know, there are enough people buying and wearing them. But the person who's creating it, in a way it's connected to that lady's comment. That, is there any thought, are you all working on that aspect of it? How to encourage young and new masters to add glamour to it, you know, to become a weaver or a stone craftsman, etc.
I think, yes, there are people who have addressed that, and I think one of the most dramatic demonstrations has been by Judy Frater in Kutch, who works with the traditional weavers and has set up a design school specifically for artisans. And every design school term, the course ends with a fashion show in which professional models and artisans together are on the ramp. And I was a bit horrified about it at first, but then I realized how empowering this was. The very fact that an artisan was on the ramp getting applause, all the lights and the razzmatazz, I was wrong and Judy was right, because she was addressing exactly this. She was giving another dimension to dignity and saying what you're making is as good as anybody in the world. And they are on the ramps now, the Lakme fashion show and this, that, and the other thing, and they do it with great aplomb. So yes, but that's part of the marketing strategy. And we can have another session on the marketing of crafts. It's very complex.
Last question.
Yeah, you talked about. Well, I'm a lawyer though, but you talked about marketing just now. Now there's the domestic market for these handlooms and weaves. We are also in a family business of carpets and daris. A lot of Mirzapur and Bhadoi. I've been there, Banaras, and a weave. You know, a lot of weaves. We have looms also somewhere in India, in many places. What about exports being hit so badly, and especially, you know, after the GST? The weavers, I think, are in a very, very bad shape, as I see them. And they've had their good days earlier. So what could be done to boost their morale and also exports? One is the domestic market, the other is the export. I think exports would get more money.
Yes, sir.
Deep inside the villages are really not making much money. They are going to the extent of 200 rupees, not 400 rupees. It is only the urbanized areas. I've been to these places of Bhadoi, Mirzapur, and I worked there. I worked in Agra, Jaipur, and all those areas. And I've seen, even today, they are making 200 rupees deep inside the village. Only urbanized areas, they're going to 400 rupees.
Yeah,
and secondly, I see is that the DC handicrafts, I've worked with DC handicrafts and I've seen they are flushed with money. There is not right utilization of that money. Whenever it is used, it is not a proper utilization of money. That has to be looked into.
True, I think all the
and
schemes...
also you mentioned about 50 to 70 lakhs for this survey. If you mentioned that, I think that's a very, very small money.
Yes, it is. But
very, very small money. We should be talking about 50 and 70 crores. You need a lot of money for surveys.
Yes, sir, but we've been at it now for 2.5 to 3 years. And we're doing the work which no NGO should be doing, the government should be doing. One of those 25 ministries or departments should be doing this, but they're not. And we still, except for the Ministry of Statistics, that's the place where we're always welcome. The other ones, I think, tolerate us, but I'm not sure whether they think what we're doing is at all important. But there are good people everywhere, and this needs to come up. Let me just talk about the exports. The export is the only place where you get correct statistics. However, are those products that India is selling as handmade actually handmade? There are many questions overseas about that. And now we're running into trouble because the importing countries are becoming strict. The other thing to remember is that exports is the icing on the cake. It is not the cake. The cake is the domestic market. And that is something which is also a mindset that we have to get over. Because there's a constant feeling that Indian crafts' future lies overseas. Sure, it's a great market, and it's an important market, but it is not the main market. The main market is right here. The main market is in the shopping malls. But you cannot use the Government of India's schemes to promote crafts in a shopping mall, because they will insist that you do a demonstration. And shopping malls are organized in a way, you can't do demonstrations in a shopping mall. You can't. All kinds of problems arise. Fire safety, this, that, and the other. We're completely out of date. So, exports is important, but it is not the most important.
Mr. Fabian?
I better stand up so that, you can hear me better. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Professor Chatterjee, for taking us on a journey which is troubling. And you want us to have 2020 vision in the year 2020. Now, my question based on ignorance. You said you wanted 50, 60 lakhs. Is it not possible to get it from the CSR of our big MNCs? Is it not possible to get it from Asif, Premji and others?
We have an appointment day after tomorrow.
Thank you. Good luck.
And we're taking this book. This book called Handmade in India is a wonderful way of arguing at a table. Because if all you do is open it and look at the table of contents, you begin to realize what's at stake. So anybody who doesn't have this, I suggest you get a copy.
Thank you so much, Professor Chatterjee. Professor Chatterjee, thank you so much. You drew our attention to the extraordinary resilience of this sector, which is resilience of the people. I would like to submit that resilience comes from the fact that weaving is accompanied not only by hand, but voice. Weaving and singing goes together. Therefore, the pathways of regeneration, along with many things that you have spoken about, is thinking about creative ways of cultural regeneration. The kind of things that are happening in Mubarakpur, for example. Are you paying attention to singing and create an archive, a journey of a new song of self and social liberation as critical to the kind of tasks that we can undertake?
That's a great idea. We've had bits of it. Of course, the songs of Kabir are always there for us, but there's much more, and every craft has its culture. That is why the UNESCO Declaration on Creative and Cultural Industries points this fact out exactly, that you're not just dealing with another industry, you're dealing with the deepest part of the cultures and heritage which this planet should be treasuring. And the economics is just the path. It's not the goal. And I think now we also have another challenge, because as the government withdraws from various sectors, the private sector is moving in, which is a good thing. But when private sector moves in, the first thing they say to us is scale and replication. You cannot replicate Mubarakpur or any other craft community. You can learn from them, and you can take that learning to others, but you cannot replicate them. And Mubarakpur or Banaras or anything is not about how many items you produce. It's about how great those items are and persuading somebody to pay for them. There's a young scholar in Hyderabad called Priyatej Kotapalli, and he's done his PhD thesis in Holland on this whole question of value, of which the economic value is one. But there are all these other values which have to be treasured. But we are using the economic value to get our foot in the door, so that that weaver is not talking about 400 rupees. He should be talking about 4,000 rupees. Right? And what is also not true is that the young people want to leave. Our experiences, they do not want to leave the craft. But they want dignity and respect. If you can't give that to them, they will leave. But we have any number of cases of young people coming back into the craft the moment it gives them a square meal and respect and dignity. And that is what this space, IIC, has always given artisans. This is one of the islands in this country where you know that an artisan can walk in and will be respected and treated as an equal. There are not very many such spaces. And we probably owe that to Dr. Deshmukh and Kamla Devi and Kapilaji. Kapilaji has been our mentor throughout this journey and scolds us and encourages us in all the right ways.
President of IIC, Shri Vohra ji, Professor Ashoke Chatterjee, Dr. Kaplava Sayan, Dr. Karan Singh, ladies and gentlemen. This is my proud privilege to propose a vote of thanks. We just heard a very thought-provoking and highly informative talk by Professor Chatterjee on handicraft. He took us through the journey of craft in India. He also highlighted the challenges this sector is facing from several quarters, including the present days of industrialized world. He also tried to suggest the way forward so that this sector not only thrives but also develops and ultimately helps the craftsmen to earn more and live a good life. I am not very sure as to whether the future is really very bright because we are ushering in the era of artificial intelligence. Just yesterday, we had a very interesting talk by Professor Achyutan and 2 weeks earlier by Professor Vivek Vadhwa, both from American University. They spoke on artificial intelligence and they gave us an impression that not very far, by 2045, almost all the established jobs, be it industrial sector or otherwise, including the jobs of lawyers and doctors, are going to be taken over by the robots. And we will be shortly, after maybe 2 decades, we'll be having advertisements which will say that humans should not apply for these jobs. The jobs are only made for the robots. And of course, when we asked as to what is then the way forward for the humanity as a whole, they said that there's going to be universal basic income, which will basically come from the corporate taxes because the cost of establishment will go down, so the corporate taxes are going to multiply. Then a new tax of automation tax is going to be further added, and everybody is going to get what they call it universal basic income, some sort of dole by the government. Nobody need work. Everybody will get paid by the government for doing nothing. So let us hope that in this kind of scenario which they have indicated and which is going to unfold, the craft still survives. Now on this occasion, I would like to profusely thank Professor Chatterjee for a very interesting talk. And he was very kind enough to accept our invitation. He has traveled all the way from Ahmedabad and delivered this talk. Thank you very much, sir. I also like to thank Shri Vohra ji, our president, who took time, conducted the proceedings, and chaired the session. I thank each one of you, ladies and gentlemen, for your gracious presence. Thank you very much.